I didn't plan to end up at that cabin. I didn't even know it existed. The whole thing started with me getting lost, something I never thought would happen since I had hiked trails most of my life. I had gone up north alone for a weekend, just to clear my head and get away from everything. My plan was simple: follow a map trail for a few hours, camp by a lake I had marked ahead of time, and then loop back to my car the next day. It should have been easy, but I made one mistake. I thought I could take a shortcut. The trail was overgrown in parts, and I got impatient. When I saw what looked like a deer path heading through the trees, I figured it would connect back to the main route. Didn't. I kept pushing forward, thinking I'd recognize some landmark or find the river that was supposed to run parallel to the trail. After an hour, I knew I was off track. My phone showed no signal, and the little dot on my offline map app just sat blank against a gray grid. I tried to retrace my steps, but the woods all looked the same. Every turn I took felt like it only pulled me deeper into nowhere. By late afternoon, panic started to set in. The sun was dropping, the air was colder than I expected, and I had only packed light, just a small pack with water, a sandwich, and a light jacket. I didn't want to admit I was in real trouble, but the shadows were stretching long across the forest floor, and I knew I had no choice but to find somewhere to stay for the night. That's when I saw it. Through the trees, past a line of dense brush, something caught my eye, a straight edge, darker than the trunks around it. As I walked closer, I realized it was a cabin. At first, I felt relief. Relief because it meant shelter, maybe even a way out if someone was there. But when I got closer, I noticed the place looked abandoned. The windows were clouded, the door frame weathered, and the roof sagged under years of decay. There was no smoke from a chimney, no tracks in the dirt, no sign that anyone had been there in a long time. Still, the thought of sleeping in the open woods alone was worse. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air smelled like damp wood and dust. It was dark, but enough light came through the cracks to see. The cabin was one room, simple but unsettling. A broken chair lay in the corner. A table sat in the middle, covered with a thick layer of dirt and mouse droppings. The floor creaked under my boots, and cobwebs hung in every corner. Still, it was 4 walls and a roof, and that was better than nothing. I set my pack down and tried to settle in. I told myself it was just an old hunting shack, forgotten by whoever built it. But the longer I stayed inside, the heavier the air felt. It wasn't just the smell, it was the silence. Even outside I had heard birds, the occasional rustle of leaves, distant snapping branches. But here, in this cabin, it was like all of that had been shut out. No sound carried in, no matter how faint. Felt wrong. I tried to eat half my sandwich, but the bread tasted like dust in my mouth. My stomach was tight with nerves, and every sound I made, every shift of my jacket, every swallow, seemed too loud in the stillness. I stretched out on the floor against the far wall, using my pack as a pillow. I told myself to rest, to wait for daylight, but my mind kept racing. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. On the far wall, just above where the light cut through a crack in the boards, there were marks. At first, I thought they were just scratches from animals, but when I got closer, I realized they were carvings. Lines, tallies, scratched deep into the wood. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They weren't neat and they weren't evenly spaced, but they were definitely made by someone. Some looked older, worn, and smoothed by time, but others looked fresher, like they hadn't been there long. I backed away from the wall and sat down again, my chest tight. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a hunter keeping track of days. Maybe some hiker, lost like me, had stayed here before. But no matter how I tried to explain it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't right. I must have drifted in and out of a shallow sleep, because the next time I opened my eyes, it was pitch black. My watch said just after midnight. The cabin was freezing now, the kind of cold that sank into my bones. I pulled my jacket tight and tried not to move, but that's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to me. It was faint, but clear. The crunch of leaves outside. Slow, deliberate steps. My throat went dry. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps moved closer, circling the cabin, pausing every few moments as if whoever it was listening too. Then the sound stopped right outside the door. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but my body was locked in place. I waited for the door to open, for footsteps to enter, but nothing happened. Minutes dragged by, and the silence returned, heavier than before. I don't know when I finally dozed off again, but when I opened my eyes, a thin gray light was pushing through the cracks. Morning. I stood quickly, heart still hammering, and checked the door. It was still shut, but on the outside, pressed into the dirt, I saw them. Footprints. Not boots like mine, not shoes, but bare feet. The prints circled the cabin, stopping at the door, just like I had heard. Every part of me wanted to leave that second. I grabbed my pack, slung it over my shoulder, and pushed out into the woods. I didn't care which way I went. I just needed to get away from that place. The trees seemed endless, but I forced myself to keep moving, following the slope of the land until I finally heard water. A stream. I remembered from the map that if I found water, I could follow it downstream to a road. It took hours, but eventually, I stumbled onto a dirt service road. From there, it was another 2 miles before I saw the first sign of houses. By the time I made it back to where my car was parked, I felt like I hadn't taken a full breath in days. I never told anyone about the cabin. Not about the carvings, not about the footprints. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if my mind played tricks on me in the stress of being lost. But then I remember the feeling in my stomach when I stood in that cabin, the way the woods went quiet, the bare prints circling outside in the night. I know what I saw, and I know that cabin is still out there, waiting in the trees for whoever stumbles across it next. I will never go back into those woods again. The fishing trip was supposed to be the highlight of my year. It had always been just something we did, but after my mom died, it became more than that. It was an unspoken ritual, a thing that gave some shape to the time passing. Every summer, 1 week, we packed up and left everything else behind. Usually, it was nothing glamorous, just the drive out to the Russian River ferry, jostling for space with dozens of other men on the bank, watching shoulders brush as everyone tried to hook their limit. But this year was different. I was turning 17. My last summer before senior year began pulling me into the weight of everything else that was waiting. College, responsibility, life beyond the safety of habit. My dad booked something bigger, something that felt like both a gift and a final test. A fly-in cabin. No roads, no other people, just us, a single log cabin, and the wild Upper Kenai. The plane ride itself felt unreal. The pilot's de Havilland Beaver lifted from the water with a rumble that pressed into my chest, and then the world opened beneath us. From up high, the refuge looked endless. Green ridges folding into each other like wrinkled skin, dark spruce forests, white-capped peaks in the distance. And then the river, cutting through it all like a slash of turquoise paint, a color so bright and sharp it seemed wrong in a world of muted earth tones. The pilot angled us down, floated over the water like we weighed nothing, and then skimmed to a stop with the kind of grace that made me forget I'd been gripping the armrest so hard my fingers hurt. And just like that, the cabin was there. It sat close to the river, rough logs stacked into a single room with a porch that jutted out above the gravel and moss. The air smelled sharp, a mix of spruce resin and wet dirt, clean in a way that the city could never be. Everything about it felt untouched, pure, stripped down to essentials. That first day was as close to perfect as anything could be. The river was ice cold, pushing hard against our waders, forcing us to plant each step carefully. My dad's voice carried in short bursts, showing me again how to read the seams in the current, how to spot the subtle shifts where fish rested. We were either good or just lucky, because within a few hours we'd reached our limit. The salmon fought like they were trying to tear the rods from our hands, their bodies flashing silver and red beneath the water, their weight thrumming into my arms until I thought my muscles might give out. By the time we carried them back, I was smiling in a way I hadn't since before Mom died. That night, the cabin was filled with the sound of the fire and the hiss of salmon fillets in a cast iron skillet. The smell of butter, fish, and with smoke clung to everything. Dad poured a little whiskey into his tin cup and even let me taste. It burned down my throat, mixing with the salt of the fish and the heat of the stove until the moment sank into me, heavy and warm. It felt like something worth saving, the kind of memory I wanted to pack away in my chest. But that was the last night I felt anything close to peace. It started with the fog. The river was cold, colder than the air, and when evening came it exhaled that difference in long pale sheets. At first it looked beautiful, the kind of mist you'd see in a photograph. But it didn't stop. It thickened until the entire world beyond the porch disappeared. Even the sound of the river dulled, reduced to a muffled hum that came from everywhere and nowhere. I was half asleep when I heard the noise. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp. Too sharp to be the shifting of wood or the settling of the cabin. My first thought was a branch, maybe swaying in the breeze and knocking against the wall facing the water. But when I listened closer, my stomach sank. It wasn't random. It was steady, even deliberate. I sat up, and in the faint orange glow of the stove's dying embers, I could see Dad already awake. He wasn't moving. He was listening. His eyes weren't even on the wall where the tapping came from. They were fixed straight ahead, hard, unblinking. He got up without a sound, slid the heavy latch, and opened the door a crack. Fog poured in like smoke. The night was dead still. No wind, no movement, nothing. And as soon as the door opened, the tapping stopped. The next night it came again. So did the night after that. Always with the fog, always steady, never leaving a single mark on the cabin walls. On the fourth day, we fished farther downstream, where the river widened into a gravel bar. The water pressed against me, tugging at my legs, when my line snagged. I cursed, thinking I'd lost another fly to the river bottom, and reached down, cold biting my fingers. What I pulled up wasn't driftwood. It was a lure, but not like anything I'd ever seen. The body was carved from bone, yellowed and porous, shaped crudely like a fish. The cord wasn't nylon. It looked like twisted sinew, dried and cracked. And the hook was a shard of obsidian, chipped to a razor edge, lashed to the bone with more sinew. Primitive, brutal, heavy in my palm. Something about it made my chest tighten. Dad didn't like it either. He turned it over once, his thumb grazing the edge of the stone, and his expression hardened in a way I'd rarely seen. He dropped it into the gravel like it burned him, told me to leave it where it lay. His voice wasn't stern, it was quiet, firm in a way that felt final. That evening, the fog came earlier, thick, swallowing, pressing so close it felt alive. We stood on the porch, staring into the blank white where the river should have been. And then I saw it. There was a man standing in the water. Only he wasn't a man. He was tall, thin, his body wrong in its proportions, his limbs too long, his shoulders too narrow. The current was roaring around him, strong enough to tear any person off their feet. Yet he stood there unmoved, half submerged, still as stone. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He only existed there, a dark shape against the wall of fog. I don't know how long I stared, but eventually his arm lifted, impossibly long, too slow, too precise. There was a flick of movement at his wrist and something shot across the water, straight as an arrow, slicing flat across the current. It hit with a splash, and when he reeled it back, a salmon fought on the end of it. The fish was thrashing, but he didn't secure it. He didn't eat it. He only held it, his head tilting, and then turned. There was no face, no eyes, nothing human at all. Just the blank shape where a head should have been, angled at us like he was seeing through the fog, measuring, deciding. My skin went cold in a way I can't explain. It wasn't fear. It was something worse. The raw certainty that we weren't supposed to be here, that we had been noticed. Then he turned back to the river and dissolved into the white, as if he'd never been. That night, the cabin turned from shelter to trap. The noise didn't just return, it changed. No longer tapping, but pounding. Heavy strikes that rattled the walls and the floor. The sound came from the door, then the back wall, then the roof, moving faster than anything could move. And underneath it, a new sound, low and awful. The clicking of stones underwater, rapid and dry, echoing through the fog. The bar on the door began to shake in its brackets. The wood splintered under a pressure that felt purposeful. It was going to give way. I don't remember making a decision, only the crash of breaking glass as Dad smashed out the back window and shoved me through. The cold air hit like ice, and then we were running, packs half-stuffed, hearts pounding, the forest swallowing us. The fog followed. The sounds followed. From the river, splashing, steady and heavy, keeping pace with us as if it knew exactly where we were. Every time we stopped, the splashing stopped too. And when it started again, it was closer, always closer. Hours bled into each other. My legs shook. My lungs burned. The forest tore at my skin with every branch and thorn. We stumbled, crawled, climbed, forcing ourselves forward with nothing but the sound of pursuit behind us. Near dawn, when the fog thinned to gray, we stumbled into a clearing and collapsed behind a fallen spruce. That was when I smelled it. Rot, fish and mud, heavy and foul, rolling through the air. A dragging noise followed, wet, deliberate, something pulling itself across the ground. Came close, so close I could hear the wet scrape of it against the soil, passing by just beyond the log. And then it was gone, sloshing back into the river. We didn't speak. We just kept moving until the trees broke and another cabin appeared. Smaller but real. Smoke curling from its chimney. A man standing at the door, looking at us like he'd seen our kind before. We survived. That's the only word that fits. We survived by leaving everything behind, by running until the forest tore us down to nothing but skin and bone and breath. When I think back on that week, the memory of the fish, the laughter, the burn of whiskey in my chest feels like it belongs to a different lifetime. The rest is something else, something I don't tell people, because I know what I saw in that fog, and I know it saw me too. It had been 6 months since David died. 6 months of silence between my sister Chloe and me that felt heavier than any grief I could carry. David had been the middle point between us, the glue that kept us from drifting too far apart. He had been the one to translate my rigid, practical ways into something my sister could laugh at, and the one to make her chaotic, artistic impulses tolerable for me. Without him, everything felt fractured. We weren't sisters anymore. Just two people with the same blood who couldn't even look at each other without feeling the weight of loss. That's why I booked the cabin. I thought maybe a place away from the noise of the city, away from all the reminders of him, could help us find some neutral ground. The Ozark National Forest seemed far enough, quiet enough, and raw enough to strip things down to just the two of us again. I told myself the wilderness would be healing, that it would give us the space we needed. I was wrong. The drive itself set the tone. The last few miles to the cabin were nothing but a winding dirt road, rust-colored and rutted so deep my sedan scraped its belly more than once. The road twisted and curled through dense woods, the kind where the trees grew close enough to blot out most of the sun. By the time we reached the last turn, the day had already dimmed into a greenish twilight under the thick canopy of oaks and hickories. I could feel my shoulders tightening the deeper we went. My mind, trained to notice structure and stability, cataloged every detail of remoteness. No power lines, no signs of other cabins, no sound of anything except the muffled hum of insects that seemed to die off the farther we went. Chloe hadn't looked up from her sketchbook since we left the main road. When I said we were almost there, her voice had no music in it, flat and tired, and I knew she didn't believe me. When the cabin finally came into view, it looked less like a vacation rental and more like something that had been dragged out of the 19th century. It was smaller than the pictures online had suggested, a squat structure made from dark, massive logs. The mortar between them was cracked and gray, crumbling in places. It had the kind of presence that made you think it had been here long before people bothered to put roads through the forest. My first thought was that it looked unsafe. I'm sure Chloe saw it as rustic, as something she could capture in one of her sketches. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and damp wood. The single room was cramped, with a big stone fireplace swallowing one wall and heavy wooden furniture worn smooth from years of use. It was bare bones, almost too bare bones, but I said something about it being authentic, trying to lighten the mood. Chloe whispered that it was perfect, though I don't think she meant it for me. The first day was tolerable. We took a 5-mile hike, pushing ourselves up the rugged incline until our lungs burned. It forced us to talk, or at least mutter small comments to each other when we stopped to catch our breath. At the top, the view stretched for miles, green hills rolling into blue shadows. For a moment, I thought maybe this trip would work. But that night, everything changed. I noticed it first while sitting near the fire. The forest outside grew quiet, but not in the way it normally does when the sun dips. It was too sudden. One moment, the air buzzed with cicadas and frogs, and the next, it was gone. The silence was so heavy it made my ears ring. Even breathing felt wrong in it, like the sound was too loud. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't stop listening. That night, we locked the flimsy door and pretended we weren't uneasy. The second night, the silence came again, but this time something else followed. At first it was faint, a slow scrape at the edge of the woods. It sounded like stone dragged over stone, steady and deliberate. It didn't stop, just moved slowly along the tree line for nearly an hour before fading. I didn't sleep much. My mind kept trying to find logic. Maybe a deer, maybe wind, but the sound was too heavy, too even. By the third night, the silence settled over the forest earlier, as if whatever controlled it wanted us to notice. The scraping began almost immediately after the sun dropped, louder than before and closer. I tried to convince myself it was still far away, but when I stepped onto the porch, it was clear the sound was coming from the trail we had hiked earlier, from the darkest part of the woods. I told myself I had to know what it was. I took the flashlight and walked toward the tree line. Chloe trailed behind me, but I could feel her hesitation. When I shined the beam onto the ground, my breath locked in my throat. There were gouges, 2 deep parallel grooves torn into the earth. Each was nearly a foot apart, and deep enough to scratch through the soil into the limestone beneath. They looked fresh, the dirt still moist. Something incredibly heavy had dragged itself out of the woods. That night, the scraping moved into the clearing. We felt it through the floorboards, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. The sound was unbearable, like it was inside my skull, vibrating my teeth. When it reached the porch, the wooden boards creaked under a weight too much for them. Couldn't breathe. My rational mind couldn't form a reason for any of it. I thought of David, the way he had slipped away from me when the rope broke, how I couldn't save him. I knew I couldn't let Chloe die here too. The door began to groan under pressure, wood cracking little by little. I grabbed my map and remembered an old logging trail that led to a fire tower. It was miles away, but it was a chance. While the door screamed under the pressure outside, Chloe and I shoved open a stuck window and scrambled into the night. We didn't look back. The silence was worse now, pressing in from every side, broken only by our frantic footsteps. Every branch snapped underfoot sounded like a gunshot. My ankle twisted on a rut, sending pain up my leg, but it didn't matter. We followed the faint depressions of the old trail, the outline barely visible in the dim moonlight. It felt endless, stumbling and running through that suffocating dark. My lungs burned, and I could hear Chloe gasping beside me, but we didn't stop. The silence behind us was crushing. I kept waiting for the scrape of stone, but it never came. The absence of it was almost worse, like it was letting us go for reasons I couldn't understand. When the sky began to pale into gray and purple, I saw the tower rising against the horizon. Rusted, skeletal, forgotten, but it was there. We climbed, every step threatening to give way under our weight, until we reached the small cab at the top. We collapsed on the floor, our bodies trembling. When the sun rose, the world came alive again. Birds began to sing. Insects buzzed. Wind stirred the trees. The silence broke. We stayed in that tower until the day was fully bright, too afraid to leave before then. The thought of going back to the cabin was impossible. We left everything behind. Our bags, our phones, our car. None of it mattered. By late afternoon, we stumbled onto a gravel road and flagged down a ranger's truck. He asked questions, but we lied. We said we got lost, that a bear had torn into the cabin. He didn't look like he believed us, but he didn't press. We never heard what they found when they checked the cabin, if they checked at all. Now months have passed. Chloe and I talk again. We don't talk about that night, but it changed something in us. She welds metal sculptures now, sharp and angular things that remind me of bones. I've gone back to designing buildings, retreating into the predictable safety of steel and concrete. We both survived, but the silence lingers. Sometimes, when the city goes still for a moment, when the traffic dies down and the hum of life pauses, I feel it again, that unnatural, crushing quiet. In those moments, I hear the scrape of stone on stone, and I know it wasn't just the woods. Something waits in the silence, and we only barely escaped it. Mount Hood had always felt familiar to me. Nate and I had driven up there plenty of times before, just for day trips when we needed to get out of Eugene for a while. It was close enough to feel accessible, far enough to feel like a different world. We knew the parts where the tourists gathered, the small trails near the visitor centers, the places families brought kids to picnic. But we had never really pushed deeper into the corners no one bothered with, the parts that weren't on any map they gave out at trailheads. That was part of the appeal when we found the cabin listing. The ad was strange, short, vague, with only a couple of grainy photos that looked like they'd been taken decades ago. It promised seclusion, total off-grid living, and a cheap nightly rate that was far below any of the other rentals in the area. Normally, that would have made me suspicious, but at the time we were looking for a retreat, not a luxury stay. We didn't care about Wi-Fi or phone service. In fact, we wanted the opposite. I still remember the last email from the owner before we drove out there. His words were blunt. "Once you pass rhododendron, you'll lose signal. Don't expect it to come back until you leave." At the time, that felt like paradise. No buzzing phone, no notifications, no one to bother us. Just quiet. The drive itself wasn't bad at first. We passed government camp and turned off where the directions told us, down a dirt road that was barely marked by a rotting wooden sign. From there, it got rough. The road narrowed, potholes deepened, and overgrown branches scraped along the car's sides as if the forest itself wanted to hold us there. Nate maneuvered as far as he could, but after nearly an hour, the road pinched off entirely. He parked near a cluster of ancient pines, and we had to haul our bags the rest of the way on foot. When the cabin finally came into view, something in me tightened. It wasn't exactly what I'd pictured. The place looked sturdy enough, built from thick pine logs, but there was a dampness to it, moss climbing high on the shaded side, windows so grimy they barely reflected light. A rusted hand pump leaned in front, and the roofline sagged just slightly in the middle. Nate was upbeat as always. He squeezed my shoulder and jingled the keys, like he could brush away the unease with sheer confidence. Inside, it smelled musty, thick with the scent of wood smoke and earth that never seemed to dry. The furniture was heavy and worn, blankets folded neatly but yellowed with age. The stove was cast iron, soot blackened from decades of use. On the table near the door, I found a leather guest book swollen with damp, its pages warped. The most recent entry was dated July 1991. The words written in shaky pen, "Enjoy your stay, nothing since." We settled in quickly, trying to convince ourselves this was exactly what we wanted. Nate started a fire outside in a stone circle, and soon the air was laced with the sharp, clean smell of burning pine. We sat in folding chairs with a bottle of wine, listening to the forest settle into night. For a while, it was exactly what we had hoped for. The occasional owl, the crackle of fire, the deepening blue of twilight. But then, something changed. I don't remember which of us noticed first. Nate sat up straighter, lowering his glass, eyes locked on the tree-line. I followed his gaze. My stomach clenched hard. A figure was standing there, right at the edge where the clearing gave way to dark trees. Still, perfectly still. It was too far to make out clearly, just a shape. At first, I thought maybe it was another hiker who'd wandered close, but the longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. There was no movement, no shifting of weight, just that stillness. Nate clicked on his flashlight and aimed it. The beam cut through the clearing and landed on nothing. Empty trees. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there. That was the moment when the feeling of isolation flipped into something darker. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive, suffocating. We didn't talk about it much that night, but neither of us slept well. Every creak of the cabin jolted me awake. Every rustle in the trees sent my pulse racing. Morning light gave us some relief. Nate walked down to the treeline where we had seen the figure. He expected footprints, some sign that someone had been there. There was nothing. The earth was damp enough that any weight should have left tracks, but it was untouched. We laughed nervously over coffee, but the memory stayed with me. We hiked short loops that day, trying to distract ourselves. The forest was dense, thick with underbrush, and at one point we came across a length of rusted wire nailed crudely into a tree. It led nowhere, just vanished into the brush. It looked old, maybe part of some boundary that had long been abandoned, but Nate kept glancing back at it as we moved on. That evening, as the sun sank again, my anxiety flared back to life. We built the fire early, as if light and smoke could protect us. When the shadows deepened, the figure returned. This time it was closer, maybe 70 yards away. Still, silent. Nate lifted his binoculars, and the longer he looked, the darker his expression grew. When I took them, my hands shook. Through the glass, the figure came into sharper focus. The clothes looked like some kind of uniform, old, dark, tattered. The posture was stiff, unnatural. My throat closed. We decided right then we couldn't stay much longer. The plan was to leave at dawn, but the car battery was dead. The terminals had been unscrewed. Nate's face drained of color when he showed me. This wasn't an accident. Someone had been there. Someone didn't want us leaving. So we packed what we could and started down the dirt road on foot. No cell service, no help for miles. After the first mile, we saw it. A neat pile of pine needles on the trail. Then another pile exactly 50 feet later. Then another. Each stack small but deliberate, spaced too precisely to be natural. My skin crawled. Someone had marked the trail for us or for themselves. Further on, we found a weathered sign nailed to a fir tree. Do not trespass. Property of the U.S. Forest Service. Site 17A. Neither of us had ever heard of it. It wasn't on any map. We turned back, terrified of what lay ahead, but just as afraid of what was behind. By dusk, we were barricaded in the cabin, the door blocked with furniture. The figure returned, standing halfway across the meadow now, closer than ever. My chest felt like it was caving in. That night, scratching started against the outer wall. A dragging sound, wood against wood. When we peered out, footprints were pressed into the dirt beneath the window. On the sill, wedged into the gap, was a rusted Forest Service badge. We didn't sleep. We just sat there, waiting for morning. At dawn, we packed and left everything else behind. We walked fast, almost running. For hours, the silence followed us, except when it didn't. Because at some point, we heard it, the sound of footsteps behind us. Every time we stopped, they stopped. Every time we moved, they followed. Perfectly synchronized. We ran until my lungs burned. When headlights finally flickered through the trees ahead, I nearly collapsed. A Forest Service truck. Relief washed over me so hard it made me dizzy. The ranger who picked us up was older, weathered. His eyes hardened when we told him about the cabin. He said it hadn't been rented in decades. Condemned in 1992 after a murder-suicide by a ranger named Jenkins. He showed us a binder, and inside was a photograph of the man. His uniform, his stiff posture, it was the same as what we had seen. He drove us to a ranger station and made a report, though the others looked skeptical. Nate and I went home to Eugene. We tried to push it down, tried to chalk it up to stress and fear and imagination. But a few days later, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I opened the message, and my heart stopped. It was a photo of Nate and me, grainy, taken from outside the cabin window. We were sitting on the couch inside, looking tired and tense. Beneath the picture was a line of text. Nice to finally see you up close. That was when I understood we hadn't escaped. Whoever was out there in those woods still knew exactly where to find us. By the time we parked outside the Porcupine Mountains Visitor Center that late October afternoon, the sky already looked heavy and dim, as though daylight itself was eager to retreat. The drive up had been long, hours of silence broken by only the occasional cough from Evan or an empty joke from Jake. I had stared out the window more than I wanted to admit, uneasy about the idea of going this far out so late in the year. The Porcupine Mountains were beautiful, yes, but they were also unforgiving, and I knew how quickly the wilderness could turn against anyone who wasn't paying attention. Inside the visitor center, the Ranger Patel had looked us over in that way only experienced outdoorsmen could, calculating our layers, our boots, our gear, silently measuring whether we belonged out there or not. His eyes lingered on Evan's city clothes, on Jake's worn-out sneakers, on my clean fleece. I didn't like the way his silence made me feel. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, serious. 7 miles back, no power, no water, no service. Make sure you're there before dark. Don't go off trail. Easy to lose yourself out there. Then he slid the map across the counter and let us go. We started the hike later than we should have. The trail wound through trees stripped of most of their color, the last orange leaves clinging to black branches, the ground covered in a slick carpet that made every step unstable. The air was damp and sharp, and every breath felt like it rattled my chest. Evan lagged behind often, stopping with his hands on his knees, his breath fogging out in uneven bursts. I could tell it wasn't only exhaustion. It was the weight he carried, heavier than his pack, heavier than anything Jake or I could carry for him. His divorce had hollowed him out, and this trip was supposed to help him find some space. Instead, it seemed like the woods were pressing tighter around him with every mile. It was near dusk when we finally stumbled into the small clearing by Mirror Lake Cabin 4. The lake stretched out behind it, still and black like polished stone. The cabin stood quiet, built from thick logs, small and solid but lonely in the clearing. Smoke stains clung to the chimney like scars. The front porch sagged slightly. It looked exactly as promised, maybe even better, but the silence of the place unnerved me. The woods pressed up against the clearing so tightly that I felt like we were being swallowed as soon as we stepped inside. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of mildew and old wood smoke. The single room was cramped. A stove on one side, a cot near the window, a bunk, and a ladder up to a low loft. The three of us moved slowly, unpacking in silence, listening to the way our boots echoed against the floorboards. By the time we got a fire going outside, the last of the light had already bled away, leaving the sky the color of steel. We ate canned chili from dented tins and passed Jake's flask back and forth, the whiskey biting through the chill. For the first time all day, Evan's shoulders loosened. He even laughed once, a brittle sound but better than silence. When we went inside for the night, the fire outside died quickly, like the darkness was hungry for it. The air in the cabin grew heavy with silence, broken only by the creaks of settling logs and the occasional sigh of wind pressing against the shutters. I fell asleep quickly at first, my body grateful for rest, but it didn't last. The knocking came in the middle of the night. 3 sharp taps, steady, deliberate. My eyes snapped open, my heart racing. I thought at first I had dreamed it, but then it came again. 3 knocks, closer this time, on the front door. I sat upright on the bunk, my skin cold with sweat. The air inside felt tense, like the room itself was holding its breath. Jake stirred above me in the loft, confused, while Evan's flashlight beam cut suddenly across the darkness. His face was pale, his eyes wide. Jake went to the door, every movement reluctant. The sound of the latch lifting felt louder than the knocks themselves. When the door swung open, the cold night air rushed in. The clearing was empty, only the stillness of the trees and the black water of the lake. We stepped outside together, lights sweeping across the damp earth. That's when we saw them, bare footprints in the mud, small, human, circling the cabin. The ground was cold and wet, near freezing. No one should have been barefoot out there. The prints looked deliberate, not wandering, not lost, just moving around the cabin again and again. Back inside, we barred the door with a bench. None of us said much. The silence pressed tighter. Jake climbed back up the ladder, though I knew he wouldn't sleep. Evan sat stiffly on the cot, his flashlight in his lap. I stayed awake near the stove, forcing my eyes open even as they burned. Hours crawled by and I counted every sound. The groan of the roof, the snap of cooling wood, the rush of wind against the shutters. It was past 3 when I heard it. The faint shuffle of feet outside, slow and careful. I pressed to the shutter, opening a narrow slit to look out. The moon was thin but enough to show the clearing. About 30 yards away stood a figure, thin, shoulders sharp, standing completely still, facing the cabin. My stomach dropped. I froze there for a long time, watching it, waiting for it to move. It never did. It just stood. Dawn came like a slow mercy. Jake came down, his face hollowed by exhaustion. Evan's eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling. We ate granola bars in silence, each of us pretending the night hadn't happened. But when we stepped outside again, the illusion cracked. The footprints were everywhere now. Not just one set, but many. Small feet circling, weaving in and out of the trees. The frost had hardened their edges, making them sharp, undeniable. We argued quietly about leaving. 7 miles was long, especially when tired, and Evan said we wouldn't make it before dark. Jake insisted one more night, then first light out. None of us liked the idea, but we agreed. The second night was worse. As soon as the sun fell, the knocking started again. Not just at the door, on the walls, the shutters, the roof. Dozens of hands, tapping, drumming, relentless. We sat huddled inside, every sound louder than the last. I dared to look through the shutters once more, and I saw them. 3 figures evenly spaced at the edge of the clearing, not moving, not speaking, just standing and watching. Then a hand slammed against the glass, smearing mud across it. Evan snapped. He grabbed a flashlight and went out, muttering about needing the outhouse. We tried to stop him, but he was already gone, the beam of his light bobbing across the clearing until it vanished into darkness. Minutes stretched into 10, 15. He didn't come back. Jake finally went after him. I stood at the door, watching his light swing nervously across the clearing. At the outhouse, Evan's flashlight lay on the ground, still on, casting weak circles. The mud showed his footprints leading away, deeper into the woods. No sign of a struggle, just gone. We ran back inside, barricaded the door, and waited. The knocking grew louder, faster, all around us. Then silence. Then a single knock at the front door. Another at the back. I didn't sleep, didn't blink, just sat frozen until the first light of dawn. We packed immediately, leaving Evan's things where they were. The trail back was wrong. The markers were gone, ripped off the trees. We walked for hours, following the compass, carving an X into a trunk just to be sure. But when we circled back and saw the same X carved into the bark, the bottom dropped out of me. Something was wrong with the woods, or with us, or with both. By the time we stumbled onto a gravel road, our bodies were nearly broken from panic and exhaustion. A ranger found us and I blurted everything. Evan's disappearance, the people outside, the footprints. He didn't argue. His face hardened and he called for backup. When we returned to the cabin with him, everything looked normal. Too normal. Inside, Evan's things were untouched. Outside, no sign of the footprints. But behind the cabin, deeper in the trees, we found them. Totems, dozens of them, made from sticks and bones, tied with string, feathers swaying, arranged in careful patterns. In the center stood a larger one, draped with cloth. A strip of fabric I recognized immediately, Evan's jacket lining. The ranger called for more help. Jake crumpled to the ground, his hands over his face. I couldn't move. I just stared at the totems, at the way the cloth swayed with the breeze. Search teams scoured the forest for days. They found nothing. No Evan. No footprints. Nothing that explained the totems. Nothing that explained the figures. Back home weeks later, I got a call. The ranger's voice was heavy. They had pulled a trail camera near Mirror Lake. On the night Evan vanished, it had captured 3 people standing outside our cabin in a perfect triangle. Thin, pale, barefoot, their faces empty, sharp, and human. Strangers. Evan never came home,